for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday, December 28th issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's celebrate these great 2025 essays. This is written by David Brooks. Welcome to the 21st edition of the Sidney Awards. Every year, I give out extremely non-lucrative prizes in honor of the philosopher Sidney Hook, celebrating some of the best nonfiction essays of the year, especially the ones published in medium-sized and small magazines. I figure this is a good time to take a step back from the Trump circus and read some broader reflections on life. The Sidneys are here to help. The first Sidney goes to Aaron Parsley's The River House Broke. We Rushed in the River in Texas Monthly. It's an account of the July 4th flood of the Guadalupe River that killed all those children at Camp Mystic. His extended family had gathered at the house on the Guadalupe, and he described what happened minute by minute as the waters rose, as they sought to escape, as they got dumped into the surging river, as the house disintegrated. Here's Parsky's description of the moment. I lashed onto a tree with branches large enough to support me and pull myself out of the water. My breathing was frantic, but my mind was focused. I considered the possibility of death. I thought, if I survive, I'll be the only one. I contemplated life without my husband, my dad, my sister, her family. How could the kid survive what I've just endured? I felt fear, of course, but it wasn't intense as the terror I felt inside the house. In the kitchen, I had feared the unknown, what might happen if we were swept away. Now I experience a moment when acceptance somehow represented the fear of dying, of losing the people I love the most, or whatever else this catastrophe had in store. In The Brother I Lost for the Dispatch, Megan McArdle notes that the abortion debate goes round and round like a bad carnival ride. But McArdle's perspective deepened when her mom confessed on her deathbed that she had a child out of wedlock and had given the boy up for adoption. The unplanned pregnancy derailed her mom's entire life and made her fervently in favor of abortion rights. McArdle sought out the brother she never knew, finding only that he had died and learning nothing about his life. She wondered if she had a button that would magically erase her brother's life so her mom could have lived a more fulfilling one. Would she push it? The essay won't change your mind on abortion, but it will ground the philosophic issues of the context of real lives and real choices. I used to play Little League next to the Con Ed power plant on 14th Street in Manhattan. I knew nothing about the technical marvel I was making, throwing errors in front of Jamie Rumbelow's essay, Steam Network, in Works in Progress. Magazine is a fascinating tour through the steam heating system that keeps many New Yorkers warm. Before centralized steam, many New Yorkers burned wood, but 85% of the heat generated this way is wasted up the chimney. Wood produces so many pollutants that every hour that you sit in a room with wood burning in the fireplace shortens your lifespan by 18 minutes. Today, New York system consumes nearly 2 Olympic swimming pools worth of water per hour to produce enough steam. Moscow's system extends over 10,000 miles of pipes. Ronald Dworkin is an anesthesiologist who went on vacation and found that when he got back in the operating room, he could no longer make snap decisions. In What I Lost My Intuition, in Aeon, he describes suddenly being plagued by self-doubt when forced to make judgments that he once could navigate with agility. The essay reveals how many of the decisions we like to think are based on expertise and pure reason really depend on what's going on in our gut. He quotes the violinist Yehudi Menuhin, who also lost his intuition. When we are faced with 10 different factors all acting upon each other, and among them creating some astronomical total variables, reason is defeated, and only intuition can cope. Dworkin's patients will be happy to know he eventually got his intuition back. In experimental history, his Substack, Adam Mastroianni, asked a basic question in an essay called, "Why aren't smart people happier?" Intelligence helps people solve problems and understand situations. So smart people should be leading happier lives, but they are not. He said it's because we too narrowly define intelligence. We give people multiple choice tests in reading, math, history, and language, and we think we're identifying people who have general intelligence that helps them think through a wide variety of domains. But in reality, all these different tests are measuring only one ability, the ability to think through defined problems. These are problems with stable relationships among the variables. There's no disagreement about when the problems have been solved, and the correct answers are the same for all people. But life, he continues, is largely about undefined problems. How do I get my kid to stop crying? Should I be a dancer or a dentist? How should I live? In these problems, there is no stable set of rules to find the right answer. One person's right answer may be another person's wrong answer. We need a word for people who are really good at solving undefined problems. Charles Mann essay, We Live Like Royalty and Don't Know It, from the New Atlantis reminds us that Thomas Jefferson was rich and sophisticated, but his life was closer to the lives of people in the Iron Age than it was to ours. Jefferson lived in a world of horse-drawn carriages, yellow fever, and high infant mortality. But big difference. Mann argues that while Jefferson didn't have a reliable water source for his house, most Americans get to live within systems that provide us with abundant food, water, energy, health care. Mann wrote a series for the New Atlantic on how these systems work, which will make you feel grateful for the things you may take for granted. The Yale poet Christiane Weidman is one of my favorite essayists. His essay, The True of Things, in Harper's Magazine, walks them through some spooky phenomena. Trees can anticipate, cooperate, remember the ordinary sense of those terms, he writes. He continues, some people revived from apparent death report confirmable details that could not possibly have observed at times far from their bodies. Cut a flatworm's head off, and it will not only regrow a new one, but remember things only the lopped-off head had learned. Across the essay mentions some more. 95% of the past century's Nobel Prize-winning physicists believed in God. If no one is watching, a photon behaves in a way, but if someone is watching, behaves as a particle. When scientists in the Canary Islands shot one entangled proton, is believed as a wave. Then they went to a different island and shot another entangled photon, and it behaved as a particle. When they returned to check on the first photon, they found it had gone back in time and acted as a particle. Wyman is saying that the world is a lot more mystical and more fluid than we think. When you acknowledge the fluidity, some of our inherited dualisms don't make sense. Between reason and imagination, mind and body, belief and unbelief, consciousness and unconscious, even past and future. The kind of thing you need to understand the ineffable flow of spooky reality is not contained in the linear, logical, machine-like process we call rationalism. Perhaps The kind of thinking we need to understand a fluid world is radically different, a kind of thinking that artificial intelligence will never matter. Next article is written by Nicholas Kristof, Searching for Hope in a Tough Year. This is a season when I customarily argue that the year just ending has been the best in human history. So I dutifully sat down at my laptop and tried to write something along the lines of, sure, democracy is eroding, politics are toxic, wars are raging, America is losing allies, the planet is burning, young people will never afford homes. But other than that, I've done these best year ever columns annually, irritatingly eyesores, but now I just can't. The year 2025 was a setback of humanity. Maybe the worst calamity to strike an adult is to lose a child. That has become increasingly rare. But in 2025, for the first time in this century, the number of children worldwide dying before the age of 5 is believed to have risen by about 200,000, according to the Gates Foundation. That means that more than 5,000 classrooms of children gone before they ever learn to write their names or tie their shoes. Bill Gates noted children are dying in increasing numbers in part because the Trump administration slashed humanitarian aid. Perhaps because I've seen so many children suffering unnecessarily, I feel a need to read something reassuring, and it seems the only way I'll read such a piece is if I write it. So here goes. A starting point is to gain perspective. While 2025 wasn't the best year in human history, measured by child mortality, it was one of the 5 best years ever. Fewer than half as many children died in 2025 as in 2000. It also seems like the positive trajectory will resume after slippage in 2025 and 2026. The Gates Foundation forecasts that while the trend of declining child deaths will be slowed, deaths will at least drop in the coming year. Until around 1970, the majority of adults had always been illiterate. That's a startling editorial comment. That's a startling statement. Until 1970, the majority had been illiterate. Whew. Now we're at 88% literacy, in part because of an increasing number of girls going to school, and those educated women transform families, economies, and societies. Despite the mess in the political world, some important trends are encouraging. Drug abuse has been one of the great scourges of American times, with more than 500,000 Americans dying of overdoses since 2020. But the worst may be over. While drug deaths are still far too high and not nearly enough to be done about them, incomplete statistics suggest that roughly 30% fewer Americans will have died of overdose in 2025 than in 2023. Scientific breakthroughs also offer hope. A drug called lenacapavir is emerging as a more potent weapon to prevent HIV/AIDS. It can be taken by injection once every 6 months and virtually eliminates the risk of getting HIV. Another area that inspires me with this progress is clean energy. Climate change is still an enormous challenge, but energy economics have turned upside down and now offer a path forward. If we're willing to take it, my old college buddy, Bill McKibben, who perhaps has done more than anyone else to raise alarms about climate change, and who often as a result sounded rather bleak, is now surprisingly upbeat. In his terrific book, Here Comes the Sun, about the revolution of solar energy, Bill acknowledges all challenges but adds, we also potentially on the edge of one of those rare and enormous transformations in human society, something akin to the moment a few hundred years ago when we learned to burn coal and gas and oil, triggering the Industrial Revolution and hence modernity. It took 68 years from the invention of the solar cell in 1954 to install the first terawatt of solar power on the planet in 2022. It took 2 years to get the second. So here you have it. This wasn't the best year in human history. So much went wrong, so many lives lost needlessly from Gaza to Sudan to Ukraine. So much betrayal of our own values in America, but still, measured by child mortality, education, nutrition, or women's rights, we humans are probably in the best decade in the past 300,000 years. Plus, we have a glimpse path toward what would leave the earth worth bequeathing to babies born today. If you're looking to do your part, here's one way to do. Contribute to the non-profits in my holiday giving guide. For these groups are doing extraordinary work abroad. Thanks to my readers for helping raise $35 million for the group in the past 5 weeks. You can join us at ChristopAct.org. A-plus reader contributions will be matched by Bloomberg Philanthropics. I'm announcing my 2026 Win a Trip contest. For 2 decades, I've held this annual contest to choose a university student to accompany me on a reporting trip with a chance to write for the Times. 2025, the winner traveled through Sierra Leone and Umbria. I'm not sure where we'll go in 2026. To learn more, apply, visit MyTimesCom WinStrip. And please share this with my undergraduate or graduate students who might be interested. Another editorial comment. Christoph seems to be a very kind person who's really interested in helping humanity. AI will displace workers at a scale many don't realize. The threat of automation poses an educational challenge. On my way to meet a friend in Silicon Valley a few weeks ago, I passed 3 self-driving Waymos gliding through traffic. These cars are everywhere now, moving as if they've been part of the landscape forever. When I arrived, the wonder of those futuristic cars gave way to a far more troubling glimpse of what lies ahead. My friend told me that a huge call center in the Philippines, a center his venture capital firm had invested in, had just deployed AI agents capable of replacing 80% of its workforce. The tone in his voice wasn't triumphant, it was filled with deep discomfort. He knew that thousands of workers depend on those jobs to pay for food, rent, and medicine, but they were disappearing overnight. Even worse, over the next few years, this could happen across the entire Philippine center industry, which directly makes up 7% to 10% of the nation's GDP. The conversation stayed with me. What's happening in the Philippines is connected to what's happening on the streets of San Francisco, in Phoenix, and Austin, in Texas, in Atlanta, and Los Angeles, the cities where driverless cars now operate. I believe artificial intelligence will displace workers at a scale many people don't yet realize. In less than a decade, Uber and Lyft shrank the taxi industry. Self-driving cars could replace human drivers, among the largest occupation for men in the U.S., just as quickly. Once autonomous vehicles dominate ride-sharing, delivery routes and long-haul trucking won't be far behind. In the coming years, AI and robotics are likely to significantly reduce the level of human labor and need in occupation, as diverse as warehouse work and software engineering. We've seen economic displacement caused by globalization and immigration lead to frustration and division. The next wave, fueled by automation, will hit faster and cut deeper. Because of this, my friend has decided to commit 1% of his firm's profits to help people learn new skills for jobs, demonstrating what leadership looks like in AI age. I believe that every company benefiting from automation, which is most American companies, should follow this lead and dedicate 1% of its profits to help retrain the people who are being displaced. This isn't charity. It is the best interest of these companies. If the public sees corporate profits skyrocketing while livelihoods evaporate, backlash will follow through regulation, taxes, outright bans on automation. Helping retain workers is common sense. And such a small asset, these companies would barely feel it, while the public benefits would be enormous. Even corporations will suffer if AI dislocates large parts of the labor force, because the newly unemployed will no longer be able to afford their products and services. 1% of profits, not revenues, that's a rounding error compared with stake, and could change the trajectory of the lives of millions who will be displaced by AI. Roughly a dozen of the world's largest corporations now have a combined profit of over $1 trillion each year. 1% of that would come to $10 billion annual fund that in part could create a centralized skill training platform on steroids, online learning, ways to verify skills and apprenticeships, coaching and mentorship, and tens of millions of people. The fund could be run by an independent nonprofit that would coordinate with corporations so that the skills being developed are exactly as what it needed. This is a huge task, but it's doable. Over the past 15 years, online learning platforms have known that it can be done for academic learning, and many of the same principles apply for skill training. The threat of artificial intelligence doesn't present a job crisis, creates an education challenge. The problem isn't that people can't work. It's they have built a system to help them continue learning and connect them to a new opportunity as the world changes rapidly. To meet the challenge, we don't need to send millions back to college. We need to create flexible free paths to hiring, many of which would start in high school and extend through life. Our economy needs low-cost online mechanism for letting people demonstrate what they know. Imagine a model where capability, not how many hours students sit in a class, is what matters. Where demonstrated skills earn a credit, and where employers recognize these credits as evidence of readiness to enter an apprenticeship program in the trades. Healthcare, hospitality, or new categories of white-collar jobs that may emerge. I have spent nearly 2 decades trying to help people learn at every age. I've seen how many people aren't able to enter growing fields because they lack basic science, reading comprehension, and math skills that should be mastered by high school, but unfortunately often are not. I've also seen what becomes possible when people are given access to free education that meets them where they are, helping them to learn at their own pace. The same approach can equip workers to prepare for new careers. Millions of jobs will be waiting for them. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics predicts nearly 2 million open healthcare jobs each year for the next decade. UNESCO estimates a global shortage of 44 million teachers by 2030. The construction industry needs more than 500,000 additional workers annually to meet the demand, and opening for electricians and plumbers are growing faster than average. The hospitality and elder care industries, work rooted in empathy and presence, are expanding, not shrinking. There is no shortage of meaningful work, but only a shortage of pathways into it. The year America blew up the process. In a year when the United States seemed more split than ever, Americans united in one way. We demanded results, and we wanted them now. From ICE raids designed as a theater of terror and GLP-1 shortcuts for weight loss, to AI-generated term papers, rampaging through Doge Bros in summary, alien enemies, act deportations, America raged against the journey and clamored for the destination, no matter what the lawyers in the chat box therapists said. Outcomes seemed to be all that mattered. Winners win, losers follow rules and talk it over. The pattern was most conspicuous in Washington, that swept aside norms, starting with President Trump's inaugural day assembly of billionaires and followed by a Project 2025-led smashing of the traditional rituals of administration. Regular order in Congress gave way to federal shutdown. Ad hoc continuing resolutions forced votes on bills like the Epstein Files Transparency Act. With impoundments, the White House appended the Constitution's carefully choreographed system for enacting spending bills. Detain first, think later became the angry spirit of immigration enforcement, even as the Department of War, renamed without the required congressional process, launched kinetic strikes that summarily executed dozens of people accused of being drug couriers. But liberals in exile bristled at processes too. The autopsies of the 2024 election result bemoaned Biden-era failures to deliver infrastructure like electric vehicle charging stations and affordable rural broadband. Thanks to a best-selling book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, abundance became a government philosophy committed to clearing away decades of accumulated government process. No longer would subway terminals, highway miles, housing starts, and high-speed rails hang in the balance of endless NIMBY delays. Even the libs said, "Build, baby, build." The collapse of tried and true processes spread beyond politics, and sports fans moved from trusting the process in year-slog team reviews, sorry Sixer fans, to the split-second gambling pleasures of betting parlays. Social media content producers competed for instant dopamine as it hits the attention spans, hits new lows. At work, the journey of the job application process dissolved into an AI arms race for robo-applications and chatbot screeners. In finance, the S&P 500 reached record highs. Long-term earning ratios be damned. Even the process of thinking itself, scientists found, started to weaken with the use of AI. The 2025 revolt against process signaled the final collapse of a powerful idea that once promised to hold the country together. At the height of America's 20th century power, belief in process served as a building concept among the legal and political elites of both parties, who sought to manage our most difficult national disagreements. The value of the process is deeply rooted in American law and politics. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, ratified by the states in 1791, protects all people from being deprived of life, liberty, prosperity without due process of law. The 14th Amendment in 1868 established that same due process protection applied to state governments. But the IA took on new and special meaning in the middle of the 20th century. Process became the centerpiece of America's powerful commitment to democracy during the struggle with totalitarian regimes in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. A generation of social scientists, attorneys, and statesmen came to see the genius of American government not as any of the set values, but rather as a collection of institutions. Methods and techniques by which the United States articulated its principles and resolved its controversies. Values might change. Elections, for example, might sweep a Franklin Roosevelt to the White House to replace a Herbert Hoover. Republican control of Congress in the 1920s might give way to Democrat control in the 30s and 40s, but process offered a deeper continuity. Elections, legislative hearings, and administration turned the gears of politics while juries, judges, and the bar managed the levers of the law. Influential political science scholars such as Yale's Robert Dahl and Charles LeBron contend that social science should study what they call political economic systems. The enlightened manager-statesman might always be able to identify ultimate truths. There might be no such thing as perfect solutions for all time, but leaders could be social engineers designing the institutional arrangements most likely to produce good outcomes for companies, nonprofits, and government agencies. Consider the New Deal's labor law and the National Relations Act signed by Roosevelt in 1935. The law did not establish one best rule for wages, hours, or working conditions, did not insist on any particular way of managing companies. Instead, it created a collective bargaining system by which labor and management, the parties they knew best how to operate the business, could come to mutually satisfactory arrangements, supervised along the way by an expert agency, the National Labor Relations Board. The labor law example was especially vivid, but the point was more general. Administrative agencies, a number of different kinds, Social Security Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and a dizzying flurry of others, would be staffed by subject matter experts capable of making and updating the basic rule of American social life. Nowhere did the politics of process have more influence than in elite circles of American law. The so-called legal process approach to law route at Harvard Law School, which stood at the peak of the establishment power. Beginning in the early 1950s, two Harvard faculty members with experience in the New Deal state, Henry Hart and Albert Sachs, set out to craft teaching materials that would capture the core logic of modern American law. Eventually titled The Legal Process, the Hart and Sachs manuscript aimed to show students that carefully attending to the capacities of institutions help yield some judgments. The text grew rapidly. Like the legal process it described, it was unfinished and constantly revolving. Hart and Sachs never managed to publish it in their lifetime, but provisionally seemed to extend manuscripts' reach. Teachers at law schools around the country added case studies with each passing year, teaching a generation of law students that having good process in place was the best way to produce laws worthy of trust. The Hart and Sachs text captured the spirit of an age in which Ivy League trained leaders, relying on managerial institutions, to resolve the most vital and controversial questions of the age. If the National Labor Relations Act could establish basic mechanism for labor, and if the Securities Exchange Act could set rules for modern capital markets, then processes might be capable of mending the great fissures of mid-century American life. Congressional hearings seem to contain the excesses of McCarthyism. Government process and bureaucratic politics seem to offer an explanation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also supply the subtle mechanism for its resolution. A parallel of international legal institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the International Monetary Fund and non-governmental organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross promised a transitional legal process to keep the peace on the global range. The legal process even offered an institutional strategy for undoing Jim Crow system of racial apartheid in the American South. The Democratic Party, which dominated the mid-century Congress, was frozen by its white southern wing. The Supreme Court, by contrast, stood outside the short-term pressures of electoral politics. Brown versus Board of Education thus offered itself as the quintessential legal process decision, striking down Jim Crow segregation in schooling as a prudent exercise of moral clarity and good judgment at the nation's interest. For a decade and a half, Brown and the Supreme Court and Chief Justice Earl Warren bid to make fair process the watchword of the American Constitution. The basic idea of our due process underwrote the exclusionary rule bearing use of illegally obtained evidence in trials, the right to counsel in felony cases, and the right to remain silent. Leading constitutional lawyers, in turn, championed the Supreme Court as the guardian of the process of democratic politics. In Roe v. Wade, decided in 1973, the court wagered that process could do much more. It was the constitutional guarantee of due process, wrote Justice Henry Blackmun, that guaranteed a pregnant woman the right to choose to have an abortion, founded on the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, a right that included power to terminate a pregnancy. A series of cultural flashpoint cases followed, extending Roe's core idea that process secures certain fundamental values. The court recognized due process, rights to refuse medical treatment, to make certain decisions concerning children, and most recently, to enter into same-sex marriage. The main selling point of process was also its greatest shortcoming. As a science of technique and method, process was an empty vessel. One of the leading legal process scholars in the era opposed Brown versus Board, and as legal historians has observed, the process school offered no obvious path to distinguish good judgments from bad ones. It lacked a way identifying which rights, if any, were necessarily implied by such open-ended phrase due process. It was one thing to say the Constitution guaranteed freedom of speech, and an idea explicitly stated in the First Amendment was far more controversial. To assert that a person required a right to privacy, which had less secure footing in the Constitution. Critics chafed at the tyranny of process. At the moment of triumph, the conservative justice William Rehnquist dissented in Roe, accusing the majority of disguising its political views in the cloak of process. Other conservative critics went so far as to craft a new theory of constitutional interpretation. Originalism. The originalism preached today's Supreme Court began as an effort to strike back against the evolutionary process of living constitutional law. In politics, the process school was soon in a pell-mell retreat. Erstwhile enthusiasts for the process school discovered the powerful business groups that had captured America ostensibly independent and process-based institutions. On the left, the rising cadre of public interest lawyers gathered around the consumer safety advocate Ralph Nader to co-opt the New Deal state process for their own ends. Neither Rader, as they were known, pushed for environmental reviews that cumbersome rule requirements. By the 1990s, political scientists were observing that a distinctively American culture of adversarial legislation had clogged the channels of even the most government action. The Trump resistance is getting stronger. It's written by Michelle Goldberg. It has been a gruesome year for those who see Donald Trump's kakistocracy, editorial comment that's a new word for me, Kakistocracy, kakistocracy. Clearly, it has been a gruesome year to see what it maybe means craziness. He, Trump, returned to office nearly emboldened, surrounded by obsequious tech barons, seemingly in command of not just the country, but also the zeitgeist. Since then, it's been a parade of nightmares. Armen and balaclavas on the streets, migrants sent to a torture prison in El Salvador, corruption on a scale undimmed by even the gaudiest third world dictator, and the shocking capitulation by many leaders in business, law, media, and academia. Trying to rack up one's mind around the scale of civic discussion wrought in just 11 months stressed the limits of the imagination. The conceptualization light years or black holes. And yet, as 2025 limps toward its end, there are reasons to be hopeful. That's because of millions of people throughout the country who have refused to surrender to this administration's bullying. When Trump began his second term, conventional wisdom held that the resistance was moribund. If that was ever true, it's certainly not anymore. This year has seen some of the largest street protests in American history. Amanda Litman, a founder of Run for Something, a group that trains young progressives to seek local office, told me that since the 2024 election, it has seen more sign-ups than in all of Trump's first 4 years. Just this month, the Republican-dominated legislature in Indiana, urged on by voters, rebelled against MAGA's efforts to intimidate them and refused to redraw the state's congressional map to eliminate Democratic-leaning districts. While Trump has been able to do extraordinary damage that will have generational effects, he has not successfully consolidated power, says Leah Greenberg, a founder of the resistance group Indivisible. That has been staved off, and has been staved off not, frankly, due to the efforts of pretty much anyone in elite institutions or political leadership, but due to the effects of regular people declining to go along with fascism. In retrospect, it's possible to see several pivot points. One first was a Wisconsin Supreme Court race in April. Elon Musk, then still running rampant at the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, declared the contest critical and poured more than $20 million into a race. Voters turned out in droves, and the mass-baked conservative candidate lost by more than 10 points. Humiliated, Musk began to withdraw from electoral politics, at one point breaking with Trump. The tight bond between the world's richest man and the most powerful one was eroded. In June, Trump's military parade, meant as a display of dominance, was a flop, and simultaneously No Kings protests all over the country were huge and energetic. A few months later, Charlie Kirk was assassinated, a tragedy that the administration sought to exploit to silence its opponents. When the late-night comedian Jimmy Kimmel made a distasteful comment on ABC that seemed to blame the right for Kirk's killing, Disney, the network's parent, gave in to the pressure to take Kimmel off the air. It was a perilous moment of free speech. Suddenly, America was becoming the kind of a country which regime critics are forced off television. But there came a wave of consolations of Disney and the Disney-owned Hulu service, as well as a celebrity boycott, and Disney gave Kimmel his show back. Trump has thoroughly corrupted the justice system, but his selective prosecutions of his foes have been thwarted by judges and, more strikingly, by grand juries. 2 grand juries refused to indict Letitia James, a New York Attorney General, whom the administration accused of mortgage fraud with no credible evidence, after Sean Dunn, a Justice Department paralegal, tossed a sandwich at a Customs and Border Patrol officer during a protest. The administration sent a team of agents in riot gear to arrest him, but grand jurors refused to indict him on a felony charge. Dunn was eventually charged with a misdemeanor, only to be acquitted by a jury. Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox News personality whom Trump made U.S. attorney in Washington, tried 3 times to secure a federal indictment for assault against a protester who struggled while being pushed against a wall by an immigration agent. 3 times. The grand juries refused. Granted, all these grand juries were in liberal jurisdictions, but the rejections of prosecutors' claims are still striking. Since indictments are usually notoriously easy to secure, I think you're seeing reinvigorated grand jury process. A founder of the legal advocacy group, Protect Democrats. Nobody actually knows what's going on in those grand juries, but the outcome of them seems to suggest that people are actually holding the government feet to the fire and being unwilling to simply be a rubber stamp. Trump ends the year weak and unpopular, his coalition dispirited and riven by infighting. Democrats dominated in the November elections. During Joe Biden's administration, far-right victories in school board races were an early indication the cultural backlash that would carry Trump to office. Now, however, Democrats are flipping school board seats nationwide. Much of the credit for the reinvigoration of the resistance belongs to Trump himself. He has focused his deportation campaign on criminals or refrained from injuring the economy with haphazard tariffs. While mocking concerns about affordability, he would probably have remained a more formidable figure. He's still a supremely dangerous one, especially as he comes to feel increasingly cornered and aggrieved. After all, by the time you read this, we could well be at war with Venezuela, though no one in the administration had bothered to articulate a plausible rationale for the escalating conflict. But over the past year, it's become easier to imagine the moment when Trump's mystique finally evaporates, within few want to defend him anymore or admit that they ever did. I think it's going to be a rocky period, but I no longer think that Trump is going to pull an Orban and fundamentally consolidated authoritarian control of this country, the way it looked like it was going in March and April, after Bassan referring to Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary. If Bassan is right, it will become a critical mass of Americans' refusal to be either coward or complacent. Five Things That Should Make Us Glad the 90s Are Finally Over by Anton Jager. The 1990s had a long tail. Even as the years passed, they decided Even as the years passed, the decades seemed to linger, defining our politics, our culture, and our view of the world. Today, in the storm of Trumpism, many yearn to return to its comforts. Yet rather than give in to such nostalgic attachments, we should be relieved that the 21st century, polycrisis and all, has truly begun. Number 1, China leads the way on green transition. In the 1990s, as Europe and the United States were deindustrializing, it was supposed that the West transmitted its smokestack industry to China, turning it into a dirty periphery of global capitalism. Of late, this story sounds woefully outdated. China is burning record amounts of coal, but is also flooding global markets with green tech. In Pakistan, a major beneficiary of the glut, solar panels are everywhere. Amid anxieties of overcapacity, China not only is committed to aiding the world's transition to net zero carbon emissions, but also in helping a country sensitive to energy outrages. It seems that decarbonization is indeed happening, not just in the way the West imagine it. Number 2, free marketeers call for state intervention. Mario Draghi, former Prime Minister of Italy and head of the European Central Bank, is not known as an enemy of markets. In the 1990s, he was a firm proponent of the European Union that entrenched the rule of private capital. In the past 2 years, as that consensus has started to crack, Mr. Draghi has become a loud voice for public investment. That even the high priests of market liberalization are clamoring for more active state intervention shows that should be no nostalgia for Europe's end of history. No matter how adrift the continent appears, today is good that the complacently neoliberal Europe of the 1990s is gone. Number 3, a Muslim Democratic Socialist wins New York. 30 years ago, the election of Zohran Mamdani as New York's mayor would have been unthinkable. Today, whatever he makes of his mayoralty, it can be chalked up as a major victory for the left-wing populism, whose record to date has been mixed, but it also shows that the crisis of male loneliness has corrected on the left, too. In a teleconvergence, the former host of America's favorite underground broadcast, Nick Mullen, Stavros Halaki, and Adam Frian, supported Mr. Mamdani as the candidate gamely took to countless podcast studios. That a typically contemporary medium, mostly known for its nihilism, could take to political activism is another reason to welcome in the 2020s. Number 4, Friends is taken on Netflix UK. It's hard to imagine a show more emblematic of the 1990s than Friends, of which I'm proud to say I've never seen an entire episode, just the occasional snippet when zapping through the dispiriting catalog of contemporary television. Critics have described the show as an Asgard from post-history, a set of mythical creatures babbling about divine banalities in an age when public debate had nothing to offer. That the show is soon to leave Netflix, one of those other defining scourges of today's entertainment industry. In Britain and elsewhere seems richly symbolic for the epic. Perhaps the time has come for new gods. Number 5, protests keep growing. Has Western man become a political animal once again? In political theory, the 1990s were often cast as an age of post-politics, an era in which political engagement was the exclusive province of specialists and technocrats. No longer. Since 2017, protest activity has been on the rise across the West, not least in the United States, where the size of this year's No Kings protest was not far behind that of Black Lives Matter in 2020. So far, the achievements of these protests have been rather minimal, but it's hard to see that they should be cast as a major pathology for Democrats. In the end, excitement, however hypothetical, is still preferable to apathy. Just one or two articles on public health. Public health statement that left me bereft. Number one, when we were growing up, our parents didn't use a drug. They used a belt and whipped our butt, and told us to sit down. Answer, this was the demerited wisdom from Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama at Mr. Kennedy's confirmation, hearing a talking about treatment for attention deficit for children. Number two, there's two studies that show children who are circumcised early have double the rate of autism. It's highly likely that they are given Tylenol. Mr. Kennedy made the first public link between Tylenol use to infant circumcision and the onset of autism in an October cabinet meeting. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, December 28th, issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times review section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley. Thank you for listening, and I wish all of my listeners a happy new year filled with peace and joy and good health.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another